Scotland, according to an old saying, was born fighting. Over the centuries, her soldiers have crossed swords with many enemies: the Romans, the Vikings, the English, especially the English. To their enemies, they were savages, a warrior race, the stuff of nightmares. The names of their heroes and battles have gone into legend: Bruce, Wallace, Bannockburn, and of course, Culloden. It was at Culloden in 1746 that the Scottish Highlanders, led by Bonnie Prince Charlie, were massacred by the British Army. And yet, within a few years, men who'd lined up on opposite sides of the battlefield were fighting side by side, Highlander and Englishman, shoulder to shoulder. Men like my own great-grandfather, Surgeon John Ogilvie from Aberdeenshire. He was decorated in the Crimean War, proud to play his part in Scotland's great military history. Here on the Somme, and on battlefields all around the world, Scots gave their lives for king and empire.
And that's the thing, they died for Britain's kings and queens and the British Empire. And yet for centuries, the Scots and the English had been bitter enemies. What fascinates me is how and why all that changed. How in the space of little more than a generation, they went from being the kilted bogeymen to the heroes of empire.
This is Culloden Moor, near Inverness. Here in 1746 was fought the last battle on British soil. It's a place central to the history of Britain and the history of the Scottish soldier. The records show that Bremners fought here, possibly my ancestors. Soldiering is in the family.
I must have come here for the first time about, all of 30 years ago as a boy. But I can still remember it's got an extraordinary, eerie, desolate atmosphere to it.
The Act of Union in 1707 had united the parliaments of England and Scotland. As Britain built an empire abroad, it hoped for stability at home. But one man had other ideas. In 1745, Charles Stuart, the Young Pretender, returned from exile in France and raised an army of Highlanders. He planned a coup d'etat, an overthrow of George II and the Hanoverian dynasty. His Highland soldiers were feared and despised across much of Britain, including most of lowland Scotland. They marched south. By December, they'd reached Derby, only 5 days' march from London. The capital lay at their mercy, and the citizens of London were genuinely terrified of an assault by the Highland barbarians. It didn't happen. When the promised support from France failed to appear, Bonnie Prince Charlie's generals persuaded him to turn back. After one more victory at Falkirk, they reached the Highlands, where they'd take their last stand. On the 16th of April, 1746, 7,000 Highlanders lined up here to do battle against the Duke of Cumberland's 8,000 government troops. 4 of Cumberland's regiments were themselves Scottish, loyal to the British Crown. What followed was savage, short, and exceptionally bloody.
Inside an hour, 1,200 men were killed, almost all of them Jacobites. An eyewitness wrote that the moor was covered in blood and the soldiers looked more like butchers than Christian soldiers. Here was the ruin of the Jacobite cause.
Absolutely brutal. Not just brutal in the fight itself, but what happened in the battlefield afterwards. No quarter given. Prisoners, any survivors, dispatched where they stood or where they lay. It is one of the darkest days of the British Army. No British regiment has Culloden on its battle honours. What the British Army wanted to do, what the government army wanted to do, was to get rid of the Highlands as soon as possible and go back to where the real action was, and that's in the continent of Europe, fighting French armies. This is a sideshow as far as they were concerned. The best way to do that, of course, was just to brutally repress the Highlands as quickly as possible, make sure that nothing could ever rise against the government army again.
New repressive laws were rushed through to crush any Highland resistance. Scots were forbidden to carry weapons. Clan chiefs lost their legal powers. Even Highland dress was outlawed.
They banned tartan. Banned the kilt, banned tartan. The kilt was, if you like, the symbolic garment of the Highlands. It made them different from the rest of Britain, and that is one thing the government didn't want to do. It wanted to integrate the Highlands with the rest of the country.
Yet even after Culloden, policing the Highlands was a drain on British resources, a festering sore. In order to end the Highland threat once and for all, a different tactic was tried.
Their solution, an extraordinary solution if you think about what was happening in Culloden Moor in 1746, was just 10 years later to start recruiting Highland regiments, many of them made up by people who had faced government troops and fought against them just a few years previously, taking them into the British Army as regiments, sending them across the world to fight for the British Empire against France. It's an amazing turnaround. It's one of the most extraordinary turnarounds, I think, in Scottish history. People thought that France, Bonnie Prince Charlie's great ally, but the government in London's greatest enemy, people up here in the Highlands thought that the French had sold them down the river. Joining the British Army, fighting the French wherever they were across the globe. This is their way of getting their own back. I think a lot of it has got to do with that. Of course, there's another very good reason for fighting with the British Empire, and that is the fact they won. You fight with the winners, you ally yourselves with the winners. They had knocked the stuffing out of the Highlands comprehensively in the Jacobite, in the aftermath of the Jacobite Rising. Gaels had seen what the government did to people on the losing side. They didn't want to be on the losing side again.
The new Highland recruits from these faraway lands would have to be organised and trained into British regiments, ready to take on the French. That task would fall to the clan chiefs, many of whom had led the Jacobite forces. This is the island of Coll in the Southern Hebrides, home to a historian whose own military roots go back to those distant days.
It was a covenant, if you like, between the government would give commissions to former regiments to a major landowner who could raise men for rank, then he gave him enormous political power to people wanting commissions. He would do it in exchange for their vote. And somebody like the Earl of Breadalbane, who could raise 1,600 men in his own estate, which stretched from one side of Scotland to the other. 1,600 men wasn't enough for the amount of regiments he'd got. So he would go to one of his friends, who he knew in the Highland Society of Scotland, say Alexander MacLean of Coll, who'd been in the Western Fencibles in the previous war, and he'd get him and he'd produce 100 men. And that was a company. And so as a result of that, he became the major. And he was followed, I'm quite certain that he was followed by people out of loyalty, that they'd always followed him. My father had done the same, so they would want to do it.
So in creating the regiments, you had a structure there in
already,
the clans.
built it into the society.
Well, they were private armies, essentially.
They had private armies.
So to form a regiment, it was a question of putting together these private armies, the laird's household men, yeah, putting them together, amalgamating them, and forming regiments.
And going off to